All right, hello, welcome. My name is Shaina. I'm an astrologer, tarot reader, and I guess a bit of a true crime enthusiast. And I know, isn't every girl on the internet? Yeah, whenever I watch a true crime documentary or some YouTube video about it or whatever the fuck, I always will look them up and analyze their birth chart while I watch the video. And so I was like, why don't I just make a video where I describe the person's, crime before the crime, their life, all that sort of stuff, while simultaneously speaking about how you see this through their birth chart. I think these are the cases that are the most interesting to look at their birth charts, because usually people in true crime, you're like, what motivates them, what makes them do the things they do, and honestly that can pretty much all be found in someone's birth chart if you ask me. Because I'm a crazy astrology girl. Obviously, there's going to be a bunch of stuff that I miss out when I'm talking about how it relates to their birth chart. I literally can't get to everything in this video, so I will always put the person's birth chart in the description so you can pull it up, you can analyze it yourself, and please leave any findings that I didn't discuss in the comments. You also might hear some snores or some pitter-patter or some sound in the background. That is my puppy. So to get the advertisements out of the way really quick, I sell birth chart readings, which I just completely revamped and redid my whole website. I offer a lot new readings, different readings, and I think it looks a lot better, so check that out. I have an astrology TikTok and I have a personal Instagram. Also, I'm wanting to do a sort of like Ask an Astrologer, Ask a Capricorn, Ask a Dumb Girl segment coming up. So if you would like to email me a question for that answer to be featured in an upcoming video, the link to my email will be down in the description bar. So really quick, before I jump into this video, I would like to put a big disclaimer. These videos are going to be highly controversial, especially my opinions about things. I have pretty controversial opinions. Also, if I say like, oh, I think this placement is where this bad behavior comes from, and you're like, I have this placement and I don't do that. Well, yeah, that makes sense. These placements are multifaceted, so I'm not trying to hate on anything. But I'm also not trying to say that everything is rainbows and butterflies. So if you don't like the way that I conduct myself in these videos, I think that's more than understandable. You can leave a shit ton of hate in my comments section. All right, so for this first video in my true crime astrology podcast that I am very excited about starting, I'm going to do it on, honestly, and y'all are gonna hate me for saying this, I am doing it on my favorite person, not only just in true crime, but probably just one of my favorite people in general, and that is Ted Kaczynski, aka the Unabomber. You know that question where it's like, oh, if you could have dinner with anybody in the world, alive or dead, who would you have dinner with? My answer would 1000% be Ted Kaczynski. I would love to pick that man's brain. I'd be so interested. And I know that it's really controversial or whatever to be like, oh, this is my favorite person in true crime. And no, it's not because I think he's cute and I want to date him, or like I think he's some heartthrob. That's not the kind of person I am at all. And also, I would like you guys to remember that a lot of your favorite celebrities are also murderers. Okay? Caitlyn Jenner, Alec Baldwin, Laura Bush, the former First Lady, Sid Vicious of the Sex Pistols, Suge Knight, Matthew Broderick, Keith Moon of The Who. I mean, the list goes on. You might support some murderers that you don't even know you do, okay? So don't come for my Ted Kaczynski. I mean, you can, but whatever. Now, obviously, this is the first episode to the series, so this is going to be a little bit choppier and a little bit rougher than I hope the future ones are. Ted Kaczynski was born in Chicago, Illinois on May 22nd, 1942 at 6:45 a.m. And yes, his birth chart does have an AA rating, which means that it is as solid of a time as we can possibly get as humans. This is coming directly from his birth certificate. He was born to a working class family and he has one brother, David Kaczynski, which is 7 years younger than him. So it does make sense that a lot of his planets are concentrated from houses 12 through 4, as he did grow up in a working class family, which is usually where I see the concentration of planets show up in a person from a working class family. I consider lower class to be planets 12 through 5, middle class to be planets 4 through 9, and upper class to be planets 8 through 1. This is just something that I've noticed. It's not always true. It's not always perfect. His parents say that as a newborn, he was a laughing, active, and very happy baby. I think this is shown very evidently through the fact that he is a Gemini rising. Immediately when he comes into the world, he's happy, he's active, he's laughing, he's cheerful. Now, his mom said that he quickly got sick with rashes all over his body and they had to take him to the hospital. The fact that he quickly got sick with rashes and he had to go to the hospital, I think is very evident in the fact that his 6th house is in Scorpio. He had this sort of almost like initial trauma through his house of health, which is the 6th house, and then Scorpio ruling trauma, which sent him to the hospital. And she points this hospital trip to be a big reason as to kind of like why he turned out to be how he turned out to be, which again, very 6th house in Scorpio. This initial traumatic event sent him to the hospital and really changed his being and his way of acting forever. When he was in the hospital, he was actually left alone the entire time, and he was in the hospital for a few weeks. So his parents were not allowed to visit him. They wanted to, but they weren't able by the medical facility there. And if you know, then you know that when you're a newborn, these first few weeks really affect kind of how you're going to be. And so the fact that he was segregated, he was kept completely alone, he probably wasn't given much affection or love from the hospital staff, which also can show in that Venus intercepted. When they picked him up from the hospital, he was completely shut down. He stopped making eye contact. He basically stopped being that really extroverted, giggly, happy, active kid that he was in the beginning. And I think this is a major 12th house sun experience. That Uranus kicks off being in his 12th house, which was this weird event. He got these odd rashes on the body. They sent him to the hospital. He had to be alone. He didn't get much affection. He wasn't socialized. It's very sun in the 12th house, this feeling of neglect, this feeling of isolation. He was in the womb, which that's the 12th house. He was brought into the world, the 1st house, and then he was immediately almost brought back into a womb-like state, which again makes him go into that 12th house sun. Ending that 12th house is his Saturn. This is isolation. This is dealing with your problems without anybody around you. This is coldness. This is being emotionally unresponsive. And this really did affect how he lived his life during the crime and how he lived his life after his crimes. Another place that he has a concentration of planets is his 3rd house. And he has a brother that's younger by 7 years named David Kaczynski. And it is said that his younger brother, David, loved him very much. He looked up to him a lot. He highly regarded him. He saw him as that kind of bright, shiny older brother. I think that this is very much shown through that 3rd house moon, that 3rd house Leo moon. He has a very heart and soul connection to his brother, and his brother has a very heart and soul connection to him. Ted even has a 3rd house Pluto, and David has a Venus in Scorpio, and so these things are very connected because the 3rd house is the house of siblings, and Pluto is that life or death connection, this really strong bond. Even his mother said to never betray Ted, never ever under any circumstances ever abandon your brother, which is that Venus and Scorpio bond being created. And then that's reflected in Ted Kaczynski's 3rd house with that Pluto in the 3rd house and that bond being attached to him by his brother. In lower education, Ted Kaczynski was known by his classmates as being a smart but lonely individual, and also that it was very tough to get to know him. Some people found him a little bit offbeat, a little bit odd, even maybe sometimes off-putting, but nobody was ever threatened by him. You'll hear that a lot throughout this video. He has a huge Gemini stellium. His Uranus, Sun, Saturn, Mercury, and Jupiter are all in Gemini, as well as his rising sign and his Lilith sign. He basically has a 7-planet stellium in Gemini. That is huge. This is a very highly intellectual individual. Gemini is his rising sign. His Mercury is in Gemini, which Gemini rules Mercury. Gemini rules his chart. Mercury rules his chart. They're both conjunct. They're both in Gemini. They're also both conjunct Jupiter. Jupiter expands any planet it touches, so that makes his intellect even bigger, even stronger, even smarter, even crisper. He is just an insanely intellectual individual. And also with that smart but lonely, again, that goes into that 12th house nature. Also that Leo moon. There is a major independence and autonomy that I find often to be associated with Leo moon that's rarely talked about. We think of Leo moon as the big performer energy, as the yeah, da, da, da. But no, when it's in the moon, it's a lot more subtle. It's a lot quieter. It just goes, I'm a one-person show, which is very much what Ted Kaczynski was. He was a one-person show. I mean, it wasn't a show, but I mean, it kind of was, but you know what I mean. Also, the fact that he was lonely is again displayed through his Venus in Aries, intercepted. Venus is our want to associate with people. Venus is our want to collaborate, be even attractive to others, you know, romantically, sexually, sure, but also just friendship-wise. And with that intercepted, he never really maybe had that lust, had that want. I mean, we all have that want to be accepted. Obviously, we are people. But with him, he never probably knew how to get it. He never knew how to find it. And it also just wasn't a big priority to him because his Venus in Aries is very much alone in his chart. Also, we see this with the Libra interception. Libra rules Venus, and so not only does he have his Venus intercepted, but he also has his Libra intercepted. And again, this adds to that not really understanding other people, not really being the most social, not really having friends. The 5th house is the house of fun. He didn't really do many things for fun. He did everything only for the intellectual gain of it, even in younger schooling. Now, Aquarius is odd. So the fact that they said that he's a little bit odd, he's a little bit offbeat, you know, he's a little bit of a questionable person, you know, we don't really understand him. That is very typical Aquarius midheaven, you know, they're the weirdo, they're the odd one out, they don't really have a group that they fit into. And also the fact that his Aquarius midheaven is square his Saturn also shows again even further that level of isolation, also that level of being very put together, being very much not wanting to show much emotion, not wanting to show much friendliness, just kind of being, like they said, this lonely but smart individual. His parents mentioned and emphasized a lot through his life that they value intelligence and success in school above anything else. This will immediately put Mercury in the 1st house. Like, that's just one of those like staple things that come together. It's a stereotype. He was actually so smart that in 5th grade, he took an IQ test and he got a 167, which if you don't know the rankings of IQ tests, anything above 140 is considered genius, and he got 167 in 5th grade. Einstein is estimated to have around a 160 IQ. This is all obviously shown through that fat ass Gemini stellium. I'll be referencing it a lot. He's got a part of fortune in Virgo, which is the other Mercury ruled sign in his 4th house. So again, it was his family's nature to kind of push intellect, to push success in school. And part of fortune, if you don't know, is a more minor asteroid. And the part of fortune is basically like Jupiter, but without karma. So Jupiter, you know, what goes around comes around. However, with part of fortune, it's just kind of like, this is just easy for you. This just comes really nicely. Even if you fuck up a bunch, you can't really fuck up with your part of fortune because you will just get good out of it. So with this part of fortune being in Virgo in the 4th house, he comes from a pretty good home. They cared about him a lot. You know, it's mentioned a lot of times his parents made a lot of sacrifices for him and his brother. And also with it being in Virgo, he can't help but just be smart. I think all of that stellium in Gemini is almost disposited into his part of fortune in Virgo in the 4th house. Now, because he scored a 167 IQ in 5th grade, they wound up having him skip 6th grade and go straight to 7th. This became another very pivotal moment in him growing up. When he skipped that grade, he just did not fit into those students at all. This actually made him experience a lot of bullying. He has this 0-degree Uranus and 1-degree Saturn. So he was actually born at the start of a new generation. So a lot of him and his classmates had this Saturn and Uranus in Gemini. Whereas if you just go 1 year before him, most students probably still had their Uranus in Taurus and their Saturn in Taurus as well. So it makes sense that him just skipping 1 grade would actually be very pivotal. He wouldn't fit in with that generation of classmates because he was born right on the cusp of a new generation with Saturn and Uranus entering Gemini. Moving on to high school, he wound up skipping grades again. He skipped not only 11th grade, but also 12th grade, and he graduated high school at the ripe young age of 15. He couldn't even get his driver's license when he finished high school. He wound up entering Harvard at a scholarship at 16. Normally, 3rd house rules younger schooling, like lower education, and 9th house rules higher education. He was only 15. You have to be between the ages of like 19, 20, 21 to actually get into your 9th house. His concentration of planets isn't in his 9th house because he was still in his third house area of life, entering higher schooling at 16. And so that makes sense why he has that Aquarius detachment in his 9th house, because he never really got to do his 9th house. He was a young kid still going to Harvard. Throughout his entire schooling, there is no mention of a girl, a girlfriend, nothing at all along those lines. And this is very obviously shown to me through his intercepted 5th house in Libra. Intercepted 5th house people don't really get to have those like fun, free, you know, I'm going on my first date, I'm going to prom, I'm going steady with this person, or whatever the fuck you want to call it. Especially with it being in Libra, and with his Venus intercepted too, he never had those friendship outings, those, oh, I'm gonna take my first drink with my high school friends. He pretty much just studied. That's all he did. His hobbies were math and studying. He also has 0 planets in the 7th house or the 8th house. So that shows that he not only didn't have these experiences, but there was nothing really in his chart to drive him to have these experiences. Because those are the 2 other relationship houses. It's the 5th, the 7th, and the 8th. Now, he was financially supported by his parents for a long time, pretty much most of his life, honestly, which is kind of surprising to hear because he's so smart. You'd think somebody that was so smart wouldn't need financial help from his parents, wouldn't need all this support, but he actually really did. And that is very, very much highlighted through that Neptune in the 4th house. You kind of always will be relying on somebody in your family or somebody in a, you know, in your community that you consider your family or your partner, whoever it is. You'll kind of always need to rely on somebody to get by. And again, this is shocking also because of all those Neptune squares to his Gemini stuff. He's smart. He's capable. He's not some burnout on the couch, you know, the typical Neptune in the 4th house is just eating pizza and sleeping in his parents' basement. That's not what he is. He's impeccably smart. He's actually pretty responsible. He's more than capable. However, he still relies heavily on his family, especially for financial reasons. Also, with that part of fortune in Virgo in the 4th house, this shows that he was able to rely on his family and they were able to help him and support him, which was lucky. Again, in college, everyone described him as lonely, and to himself. He also has this double Leo, double Aquarius energy to make up for his intercepted Aries Libra. And so with double Leo energy, this just means somebody that's a lot more content being alone and being by themselves than most people. He can kind of always entertain himself, and he has all that Gemini energy to kind of keep his brain always mentally stimulated. And then with that double Aquarius, he doesn't really care if he's seen as odd. He just kind of wants to do his own thing and is happy doing it. A big part of his time at Harvard that is often referenced is this study that he participated in, which was said to be purposefully brutalizing. That's how it was described. It was led by this Harvard psychologist named Henry Murray. This immediately makes sense for him to be in this weird psychological study. He has this 3-planet stellium with Uranus, Sun, and Saturn in the 12th house. That's very much psychological study. This odd offbeat thing, Uranus, this Sun, he participated in it for a long time, and this Saturn, it was brutalizing. People speculate that this is a lot of the reason as to why he was so, you know, mentally fucked up. 3rd house Chiron. Henry Murray conducted these experiments to look at the effects of stress and resilience to aggressive interrogation tactics. Ted actually wound up spending over 200 hours in this study over the course of 3 years. That's almost his whole college experience. I think this is also very much shown as him having his Saturn in the 12th house, having to deal with these psychological experiments alone. Nowadays, it would be completely illegal and completely against almost every rule to conduct experiments in the way that Henry Murray did. In this study, the participants had to basically write personal manifestos, which very much connects later, and it was told to them that they would be debating their philosophical ideas with another student, which would definitely pique a Gemini stellium's interest, like, oh, I get to debate my ideas. This is great. However, this was actually a complete lie, and this was not at all what happened in the study. Very Pluto in the 3rd house, that he was lied to about this psychological study. They were actually going against people who were hired by Henry Murray, and he gave them a script to read during this process. And it was a script where their main goal, they were told this, was to personally attack, humiliate, and traumatize the other person based off of this personal manifesto. manifesto. But also they got petty too. Like they were talking about, you know, how the person looked, how they held themselves, everything. This is very much Mars in Cancer. He was just constantly defending himself. The evidence found in this study was intended to use for interrogation tactics. The idea was that in doing this, in completely breaking down a person, the person would then become more malleable to admit to committing a crime and then follow the rules, which based on the crime that happened, the exact opposite happened with Ted Kaczynski. I think that he continued in this study to prove that he couldn't be broken and he could take it and his ideas would hold up. I think that the more he kept getting hit with it, the more he saw it as a challenge. Because again, Sun in the 12th house, I think he almost found himself a little bit through this experiment. And then Saturn in the 12th house, like, this will not break me, this will make me stronger, and I'll prove it to you. And if you look at his Saturn, the ruling planet of Saturn is Capricorn, and his Capricorn is in his 8th house. This was also a very traumatic experience. That's very 8th house. He kept it very private. That's very 8th house. And he probably felt like he needed to be broken to be a person, which it's very Capricorn to like the challenge of it all, honestly. Now, his brother commented that sometimes it's better to be broken than hardened. I think this quote really shows the biggest difference between Ted and his brother David. David is a Libra Sun, Pisces Moon. This combination makes a very malleable person. Libra is a very Venusian, lovely, sweet energy. They don't want to see conflict in their life day in and day out. And then Pisces, well, Pisces is just too empathetic to be hardened. I think that they see a lot of love and a lot of truth in somebody that is broken. They see a lot of vulnerability in that, and I think they admire that, whereas there's no Libra in Ted's chart at all. Ted graduated Harvard at 20 years old with a 3.12 GPA and a degree of Bachelor of Arts in Mathematics. And I really do believe that Ted Kaczynski is literally the best example of what the American public school system can create. I mean, look at all of his third house energy. He only went to public schools. He went to the American college, the best American college. The American system basically really created him and then also completely destroyed him. That's literally Pluto in the third house. After he graduated, he became an assistant professor at Berkeley. He claimed also that he only wanted that job so that he could save enough money to buy a piece of land and to live off that land. And I think this is also very much shown by that second house Mars. There is something with the second house Mars that I've noticed that wants to work with their hands. They're really good with tools. They're really handy. They really want to usually live a very simplistic lifestyle. And I find a lot of times people with Mars in the second house hate the idea of money. And so he was only working so he could save up money so then he wouldn't have to work for the rest of his life and he could live off the land, because the second house rules finances. Mars is anger and hate as well. So it's hating money, honestly. So I think all that makes sense. All right, for the last part of this segment, here are a few notable things I found in my research which could definitely contribute to creating the Unabomber. First, I would like to note that the reason why we know so much about him and what he thinks and kind of the inner workings of his mind is because he always kept a journal. Spoiler alert, after all his crimes and he was discovered, the FBI found 20,000 pages of handwritten journal entries that were dated all throughout his lifetime. Some were in code, some weren't, but this is very much a Gemini stellium, a Mercury ruled chart, Lilith in Gemini as well. Lilith is a compulsion, so he's just constantly writing, constantly documenting. Some people say that he hated women, and I think that it's more of just the fact that, in my opinion, he kind of feels like the world's first incel, which is very Gemini Leo energy, very intercepted Venus energy, very Mars in Cancer energy as well. That incel sort of, you know, Mars in Cancer has some trouble going after what it wants, isn't usually able to spit much game at women when they're a man. The last story that I'm going to bring up is incredibly interesting. We know about this because he wrote about it in his journals. He had this short stint where he was having erotic fantasies about wanting to be a woman. Very Gemini, curious about the other side of things. I think this less has to do with him wanting to be, you know, a person in drag and be a girl. I don't think he had that quality at all. all, but I think it has more to do with wanting to have some of that elusiveness, some of that attraction, some of that feeling of being chased by somebody that his Venus and Aries intercepted never got, and his Mars in Cancer might have wanted as well. It is even written in his journals that at one point he seeked out a sex change. This happened in his 20s, which occurred in the 60s. So this is a very big deal that a lot of people were not curious or talking about or even willing to go towards. He even made an appointment with a psychologist at the University of Michigan to talk about this thought of wanting a sex change. And when that day came, he got freaked out and he panicked. When he got to the meeting, he decided that he didn't want to talk about it. He was probably really embarrassed from the idea of bringing it up, especially with that Saturn square midheaven, for him to like show anything that he's thinking or be vulnerable in that way was probably really scary for him. This is also very Venus square Mars. And if you're wanting to know more about this, I talk about the kind of slight gender dysphoria or gender confusion that comes with being a Venus square Mars. Also, I didn't mention this, but Venus square Mars has a lot to do with that social awkwardness as well, and that feeling of not being quite right in your body, that feeling of something being off. And sometimes we can denote that feeling of something being off in our bodies with being the wrong gender. And sometimes that is true, but sometimes it is just this confusion. So after this meeting with a psychologist was when these feelings of violent anger and rage started. Also, the fact that he had these violent thoughts and this want to kill, but he didn't act upon it until years later is also very Capricorn in the 8th house. Planning and strategizing for a while until he actually acts upon it. In a quick little summary of his crimes, Ted Kaczynski was active between 1978 to 1995, which is 17 years. That is a long crime sprint. He sent 16 bombs in total and all but 2 were detonated. He killed 3 people and he injured 23. I think this lasting power is shown through that 0-degree sun. Yes, his sun is in Gemini, but I consider it a true cusp because it's at 0 degrees. So I do consider him having some Taurus energy on his sun. And Tauruses have a very long lasting power. He's much more methodical than most Geminis. Also, he's very elusive. Nobody suspected him for 17 years. Nobody knew who he was for 17 years. That is a very 12th house stellium elusive nature. The FBI even said that it felt like they were catching a ghost. 11th house in Pisces. 11th house is how he's known to society, and it's in Pisces, and they literally referred to him, and I quote, as a ghost. As we know, serial killers, which he did, I will say, only kill 3 people, which I know that's, 3 more than you and me. That's still a certain amount of people. He is a mutable sign. We all know that pretty much everybody that kills a bunch of people, random targets that aren't, maybe just their family, they're mutable signs. And he does have very, very heavy Gemini energy. Also, I think it's really interesting that his crime was sending bombs through the mail. And if you look at that literally, the planet Pluto rules bombs, and they were sent through the mail. And the 3rd house literally rules the mail system. And as Pluto is in the 3rd house, it's literally so literal. Astrology is real. And also, he was creating these bombs completely by himself. 3rd house moon in Leo by himself. What's also really, I guess, unique about his case is that most serial killers want to see their victim. That's kind of what they get off on. There's a lot of sexual gratification for them in killing their victim. However, Ted's bombing is strictly a means to an end. His Mars in Cancer is a very docile energy, and it plays a very small role in his chart. He has that Mars in the 2nd house, which he wants to work on things, make bombs. He has that Gemini stellium making bombs with his hands. Gemini rules the hands. I think he was almost more in love and infantilized, if that's the right way to say it, by the making of the bomb than he really cared about the shipping it out and the killing of the person. He did want to see success. He is a very success-driven person, obviously, as shown in the fact that he graduated Harvard at 20. But I think that the bombings became more of a fun Mars and Cancer activity for him. Also, the fact that he never saw the pain, the harm, or the trauma that he caused to his victims. That is a very 12th house stellium thing. The 12th house is all the things that we do not see. He lived in this cabin, which we didn't see. We didn't see him. His victims didn't see him. Nobody knew who he was. Again, he's very elusive. Pisces in the 11th house. And then he has this 4th house Neptune. He's very hidden. He's very much to himself. Again, he's a Gemini stellium. It's all this like mental game that he's playing with the world. He literally becomes the puppet master of the world. Everybody is scared of opening their mail because of him. The FBI is fearful because of him. He is controlling the minds of everybody. Again, he makes his bombs with his hands, Gemini stellium. He sends them through the mail, 3rd house energy, and then the package is delivered and it's picked up by somebody's hands. So a lot of the people injured, what was injured of them was their hands, Gemini stellium. All right, let's backtrack a little bit. So we know he did the whole, professor thing, only to save up enough money so that he could buy a piece of land, which is what he wound up doing. He also was still getting a stipend from his parents every year, Neptune in the 4th house, as I mentioned. He wound up building a very small 10 by 14 cabin in Montana, and that was his whole living quarters. Neptune in the 4th house people really do not need much to live at all, and honestly neither do Mars in the 2nd house people either. They only like their items if they have some sort of practical use to them. Also, he lived completely alone in this cabin, completely segregated from people, Leo in the 4th house, Leo moon. Ted really loved actually living in nature, he said, because it forced him to live in the moment. That's a very mutable energy kind of thing. They want to live in the moment. They want to live their life day by day. Kind of the idea of if things are good right now, then so what? Things are good right now. The next moment does not matter. The previous moment does not matter. We're past it now, which I think is a very beautiful way to be, and actually one of the big things that I really like about mutable energy. He even mentioned that while living in the woods, he can just kind of sit and do nothing for hours and hours, again, which is very Neptune in the 4th house, Sun in the 12th house, just kind of almost like he was meditating. He was absolutely filthy and dirty while he was living in his cabin, very much only something a Neptune in the 4th house would be able to withstand. People with Neptune in the 4th house are very detached to their physical body and have a lot of trouble associating with it sometimes, and are just kind of like, oh, I see through my eyes, so that's what I see, and so why do I care what I look like? Also, a big reason that he did what he did was because he wanted to live as an individual and not be a part of the system, which is very much his Leo moon opposing his Aquarius midheaven. He even mentions many times that his goal with these bombings are to get back at the system. That is a huge theme of his. He has an 11th house interception. These people do not like the system. These people do not fit into any group. These people do not get along well with society. These people have a lot of trouble finding their way, finding where they belong, finding where they're a part of, and they can grow a lot of resentment and be very, anti-people because of it. If you read his manifesto, which I'll go into later, the reason why he was so against technology, which is the main theme, is because of where it was taking the human race. And so in that way, he was a humanitarian, but in the way that he sent bombs to kill his fellow people, he was not a humanitarian, which is very much intercepted 11th house. His first bomb was actually placed in Illinois, which is funny because that is literally where he's from, which is very much 3rd house Pluto, 3rd house moon. He actually got the name Unabomber because his first 2 bombs were addressed to Northwestern University. And then another bomb that he did was connected to an airline. This was one of the bombs that was found and detonated. And so the UN in Unabomber stands for university. The A in Unabomber stands for airline, and then bomber. So university, airline, bomber, Unabomber. I think that's interesting because his 9th house and his 10th house are connected. They're both in Aquarius. He is famous, 10th house, for bombing universities and airlines. 9th house, because the 9th house rules travel, airline. The ninth house rules universities. So it's very literal. What I also think is really interesting about his motivations is that his targets were not the young and innocent. His targets were the older and educated. His targets were people that were advancing technology. His targets were very much intellectually based. So the FBI is absolutely stumped on who it is. Who is sending these bombings through the mail? They have absolutely no idea. And they wound up receiving a letter from the Unabomber. It's a short letter, it's 3 pages, and it's typed on a typewriter. And the group that claimed credit for these bombings was an anarchist club named FC, aka Freedom Club. He wanted it to seem like there was more than just one person working on these bombs, and that was the whole point of it, was to create a revolutionary community against technology called Freedom Club. Very Venus in the 11th house. However, it is intercepted and it is in Aries, so in reality, he is just one person. And you know, he has passed now. Freedom Club, I don't think ever came, well, I know never came to fruition in the way that he wanted it to. He never got that Venus in the 11th house realized because it is intercepted and it is square his Mars that thwarts its actions. There was one time where he was finally spotted, and that is where we got the sketch from. So what's actually also really funny is that the sketch wound up looking a lot cooler than he actually looks in real life. He looks like a major Gemini, just like nerdy random guy, but this sketch totally makes him look like an Aquarius, like cool guy midheaven with like this aviator sunglasses and the hat. So the FBI was getting so frustrated because it's been 16 years now and they cannot find a single suspect for this case. The FBI mostly works through tips. It's through word of mouth. People saying, oh, I think it might be my husband. Oh, I think it might be my sister. Oh, I think it might be my neighbor. But because he lived in a cabin in the woods, there was absolutely no tips. Nobody at all suspected him. He knew nobody. He spoke to nobody. He had even cut off his family by this time. Because of the fact that his 11th house is intercepted, nobody knows him. And so he is absolutely making the FBI look a fool. Back to David Kaczynski, Ted's brother. David wound up getting involved with this woman named Linda Patrick. Ted Kaczynski hated Linda. Ted claims that his brother's attitude completely changed when he met Linda. He completely diverted from all of his original philosophical ideas that him and Ted shared to a much more traditional kind of middle-class view of things once he started dating Linda. David Kaczynski, as I mentioned, is a Libra Sun, Pisces Moon. These placements are very capable of empathy, which is why I think he had so much love and so much empathy for his brother Ted. But like I mentioned, they're also very capable of getting their views switched. So it makes sense that while he was growing up and his main foil was his brother Ted, he shared a lot of the same opinions with Ted. Whereas as he got older and his main foil was his soon-to-be wife Linda, his views much more aligned with that of Linda's. That's kind of that side to Libra Sun, Pisces Moon, is that highly influenceable nature. Ted and Linda wound up getting married, and Ted was absolutely furious about this. I think that this was honestly his initial feelings of betrayal coming to be. Like, how could you marry this person? Don't we share the same views? Don't we understand this certain way of life and way of thought? So why would you go against it and marry somebody who just is basically a normie? Like, let's say it for what she is. Well, Ted was very upset. He wrote her a very strongly worded letter. It was said to be very, very aggressive, very rude, and very much no holds barred. Again, in his classic Pluto in the 3rd house, moon sextile Gemini Mercury style of writing. And it was in fact because of this connection of David and Linda that he decided to cut ties with David. I'm wondering if Ted kind of foresaw something even deeper in Linda. With his Neptune in the 4th house, it's kind of like he just sort of got this gut feeling. Linda was convinced, especially after that letter, that Ted was mentally ill, and she tried to even convince David of this, who very much said that Ted is not mentally ill and that he is simply a genius. Very Libra Sun, kind of playing both sides. being with Linda, being nice to Linda, but also trying to stay by his brother. So it's the summer of 95, and nearly every single piece of newspaper has a little corner spot dedicated to the Unabomber and updates on the case. And that makes sense, as Ted does have his Jupiter square his midheaven, so he does get a lot of public time. He does get a lot of spots in the newspaper. He is a very seen person while also remaining elusive because his midheaven is square his sun, his midheaven is opposite his moon. You know, they don't know it's Ted Kaczynski, but they do know it's this figure, this brain, Mercury trine midheaven of the Unabomber. And in those little newspaper clippings, it talked a lot about how the Unabomber wanted life to go back to the way it was before technology. And Linda Patrick wound up seeing this. And Linda knows a lot about David's views and Ted's views, and she knows that they share similar ideas to the Unabomber. So Linda actually connects the two, and she speaks to David about it. Now, David is appalled. Again, he's a Libra sun, Pisces moon. He wants to see nothing but the absolute best in people. And he did not believe her. He thought she was absolutely crazy. He always saw his brother's future as so bright. He could absolutely never see that happening. Which actually, that also has a lot to do with Ted's sun square his midheaven and moon opposite his midheaven, because it shows that people did not at all expect the direction that his life took. Everybody thought he was going to be just the most bright and shiny star person in the entire world. So for years and years, Ted has been working on his manifesto on his typewriter in his cabin, and in 1995, it is complete. On June 25th, Ted mails his manifesto to multiple news outlets. He wound up mailing 5 copies, which were all typed out, hand typed on his typewriter. Very Gemini stellium, he typed it all out with his hands. It's his manifesto, it's his brain, it's his mind. As I mentioned, his Mercury is his ruling planet, it's in Gemini, but it's also at 22 degrees. And this is a very critical degree, as this is the kill or be killed degree. Yes, that is actually the phrase for it. A lot of times with 22 degrees anything, you are going to be either absolutely hated or absolutely loved for whatever that energy is. Most of the time, it comes with both. Like, without one, there is not the other. So 22 degrees is definitely an aspect of extremes. So it makes sense that it's kind of his destiny to write the manifesto. His whole point of life was not bombings. His whole point of life was this manifesto. That was kind of everything he wanted culminated. So it makes sense that he has this Mercury in its home placement of Gemini at this critical degree of 22, and it's not only his ruling planet, but it is also his final dispositor. What winds up happening is 2 of the publications, which are the Washington Post and the New York Times that receive his manifesto, decide that they both want to go forward with publishing it. And they actually run Ted's manifesto in the newspaper. So basically, on September 19th, 1995, Ted Kaczynski, or the Unabomber, he won. He literally won. His whole goal was to get famous enough that when he printed his manifesto, people would read it. People would listen. It would be public. I know that killing people and bombings is an incredibly controversial way to go about it, but without that controversy, people aren't really reading much in 1995. His manifesto, if it even got published, would have just hid in the background. Because honestly, if you know anything about true crime, fame and infamy have very much become synonymous with each other. We like people that do crazy stuff. So after they printed this manifesto, as suspected, they got thousands and thousands of leads of just everybody thinking that they knew who the Unabomber was. It's Aquarius, it's everyone, it's humanity. He reflects these ideas that so many people have heard from the people that they know. So when the manifesto comes out, Linda literally forces David to read the thing. After David read the manifesto, he said that there is a 1 in 1,000 chance that this is Ted. And Linda said, well, that's not 0. You know, 1 in 1,000 chance is actually pretty high considering how many people there are in the world. And a few things kind of gave it away. Obviously the ideas and all that sort of stuff, but also a few phrases. Like, these are very Gemini phrases that gave it away. He said the phrase, "Have your cake and eat it too." And growing up, it would always drive Ted crazy that people would say, "Eat your cake and have it too," because that doesn't make any sense. It has to be you can have your cake and eat it too. It's kind of just this little Gemini kind of order of things. In the letter that he wrote to his family, where he wanted to be, distanced from his family, he referred to his family as his stinking family. And there's a big quote in his manifesto where he says he wants to get out of this stinking system, which is kind of an odd thing that not a lot of people say. So Linda wound up getting an expert to analyze Ted's letters and the Unabomber manifesto. And basically they agreed that it was him. So who wound up cracking the Unabomber case was Linda Patrick, David Kaczynski's wife. Now, Linda was absolutely adamant about telling the FBI that he was guilty and telling the FBI that they think that it is Ted Kaczynski. And David was really torn. He was not sure what to do. He felt, on one hand, if he didn't pursue it, that Ted could kill again, and then David would feel like the blood was on his hands and an innocent person in his eyes would be dead. But on the other end, he promised to never, ever, ever betray his brother. But at the end of the day, the thought that somebody would die because David failed to act was just absolutely intolerable to him, and he decided to tell the FBI. This is a very Libra Sun, Pisces Moon thing to do. And also his Pisces Moon is opposite his Virgo Saturn. So Ted's Saturn is in Gemini. This is a Saturn that very much will twist the rules, will see things from odd sides, will play devil's advocate, whereas Virgo Saturn is much more like, these are the rules, killing is bad, and therefore nothing will change that. David is actually a 22-degree Scorpio Venus. So they both share this kind of 22-degree thing. It's kill or be killed. And literally, David had to deal with that through his Scorpio Venus, the person that he loved most, the person he promised to not betray, the person he promised not to abandon, his brother. And he said, it's kill or be killed. It's kill my brother or kill somebody else. And he chose to betray his brother. And the other thing is that David knows that if he's going to turn Ted in, that he's killed 3 people, and he's probably going to get the death penalty. And now David cannot stand this idea, which I find very interesting because it's almost like he wants to have his cake and eat it too. So David and Linda called it into the FBI, and they thought things would be immediate, but no. There were 2,417 Unabomber suspects. The number that Ted wound up being on that list is 2,416. So what wound up happening is that David and Ted's mother got really sick. David wound up being alone in our house, and he wound up going through a bunch of old childhood things. He actually wound up finding this kind of 23-page, almost like pre-manifesto kind of rough draft that Ted sent as a letter to his mom years and years ago. The similarities were absolutely striking. It was so haunting. And immediately upon finding this document, David sent it in to the FBI, and this was pretty much the nail in the coffin. It was insanely obvious that the 2 writers were the same person. Now, when the FBI got this, they actually still did not have any forensic evidence or anything like that to be able to arrest him. They only had linguistic evidence, which is really interesting with that Gemini stellium. They still only know what he thinks and what he writes like. They have no idea who he is. Sun square midheaven, moon square midheaven, but with that Mercury trining the midheaven. So with the information that they get from the neighbor and all this other stuff, they wound up being able to get a search warrant to go inside Ted's cabin. So the next morning on April 3rd, 1996, they knock on Ted Kaczynski's door. There are about 3 FBI agents, and they go up and they arrest Ted. Again, I think this is really interesting that he has this Gemini rising, and they literally go up and approach him kind of like man to man, person to person, hand to hand. You know, they do have this whole SWAT team. They do have all this kind of Mars stuff in place, but in reality, the meeting is still aligned with his Mercury and Gemini in the 1st house. So they wind up confirming his identity and they arrest him, and 17 years of crime has now officially stopped. Now, he looks absolutely crazy, quote unquote, when they arrest him and they pull him out of his cabin. He is in full-on mountain man. His hair is all disheveled. He's covered in soot. He looks like he's never showered. He's full-on Lilith in the 1st house. So before I go on to Ted Kaczynski's trial and what happened after the crimes, I want to take a short pause and go to his philosophy, because obviously his ruling planet planet is Mercury, and this is incredibly important. So Ted Kaczynski felt very alone in opposing technology for his first 30 years of life. And it wasn't until then that he found very few writers that share similar feelings. And one of these main people was this French anarchist philosopher named Jacques Ellul. I'm probably mispronouncing that. He believed that social justice and true freedom were incompatible, which is something that I think that Ted actually really adopted as well. For example, he says a person can join a fight for justice, but in doing so, they must admit it is a fight against all forms of freedom. He believed as well that technology exerted control over human destiny. He believed humans are increasingly using technology out of convenience, even if it negatively affects their human experience, which I think directly correlates to this TikTok, oh my god, technology, right, that I saw, which it talked about that there are so many studies that social media makes us really sad and does not help our mood at all, does not help us emotionally at all, but we still continue to use it, even though it negatively affects us. So Ted Kaczynski was convinced that you don't need everybody to agree with your revolution and your ideas. You just need a strongly committed minority, and that's what he was trying to do in his manifesto and in his crimes as the unabomber, as odd as that sounds. His thought was that he's not going to try to persuade the majority of people that he's right, but rather increase tensions in society so hard that things start to break down and people get uncomfortable and rebel. Now, his question was, how do you increase these tensions? And I think his answer was through these bombings and through making the mail and things like that feel so tense. These airlines so tense. Everything got so tense because they always feared that anybody could be targeted because it was so random. So that's how he was trying to kind of stress people out and increase these tensions. Gemini does kind of rule this level of daily anxiety, these daily fears, almost like overthinking quality. Ted Kaczynski didn't want to be known as this true crime person. He wanted to be used as a symbol for promoting revolutionary activity, mostly in trying to get rid of the industrial system. For example, I have his manifesto right here. He did not name it the Unabomber Manifesto. We as a society named it the Unabomber Manifesto. He named it Industrial Society and Its Future, and he wanted it to be written as FC, Freedom Club. As much as he was doing these bombings and he was killing people, he actually, more than anybody, I would say, wants the human species to survive, and that is incredibly evident in his manifesto. And his main thing is that he does not want AI and technology to win out and become the new race. Remember that this was published in 1995 and he was working on this throughout the 80s and 90s. So this was before AI came out and even was close to where it was today. Especially as we move to the Aquarian age from the Pisces age, I really do think that when we fully get sat in the Aquarius age, that's when AI will become the new human race. He also understood that you cannot face revolution without violence, and that this idea of peaceful protesting or peaceful this and peaceful that is just what the system wants you to believe, because that won't change the system. A peaceful protest won't do anything. He almost saw the people that he murdered or injured as a suffering of the few for the sake of the many. And I think that's what a lot of people don't understand. And that is why, controversial, I'm a little bit more sympathetic to his actions. Ted Kaczynski really felt like he was literally at a war with the system. And so he was taking out people he saw as opposite to his side. And his main message is that technology is moving at such a fast pace that we cannot control. The power would keep increasing and close everything down. It's causing harm to people and the environment. Stresses will continue to increase, and there's no way to modify or reform the system as to avoid these inevitable negative outcomes. So he believes that the system has to be brought to a complete and total end. We can't just modify it. We can't just put a band-aid over the situation. We have to absolutely abolish it and take the consequences that come for the greater future that will come because of the ending of the technological industrial system. And I know that there's a lot of good things in technology, and I think that he gives a really profound, amazing example of how a lot of good things can add up to a bad thing. He says, and I quote, which this is in the back of the book in reference to paragraph 128, and this is annotated number 21. Since many people may find paradoxical the notion that a large number of good things can add up to a bad thing, we will illustrate this with an analogy. Suppose Mr. A is playing chess with Mr. B. Mr. C, a grandmaster, is looking over Mr. A's shoulder. Mr. A, of course, wants to win the game, so if Mr. C points out a good move for him to make, he is doing Mr. A a favor. But suppose now that Mr. C tells Mr. A how to make all of his moves. In each particular instance, he does Mr. A a favor by showing him his best move, but by making all of his moves for him, he spoils the game, since there is no point in Mr. A's playing the game at all if someone else makes all of his moves. The situation of modern man is analogous to that of Mr. A. The system makes an individual's life easier for him in innumerable ways, but in doing so, deprives him of control over his own fate. And he talks a lot about autonomy in his book, which makes sense. He's a Leo moon in the 3rd house. He wants complete autonomy over his life, his decisions, and his mind. I can't believe I haven't brought this up yet, but I definitely believe Ted Kaczynski to be autistic. I don't think he's mentally insane. I don't think he's schizophrenic. I don't think he's this and that. I literally just think he's autistic, but you can just tell by the way he writes, and it's shown a lot in his chart as well. After getting arrested, Kaczynski initially refused all of the interviews. Everybody wanted to talk to him, everybody had all these questions, and he just did not want to say anything. Now, after a while, he finally decided that his first interview would actually be with a woman. And he approached her because they had similar views, as her writings reflected a lot of his writings. I think this is very much his Venus and Aries in the 11th house. Everybody wants him to talk, everybody is curious, and it's intercepted. He says, no, 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 I don't want to talk. And then finally, he chooses to talk to this woman that he picks. Venus and Aries, he picks them, he pursues them, and it's Venus, it's a female. A big question that everybody was asking and why they wanted these interviews to happen is he crazy? Which I think points to his Uranus square his midheaven. Everybody thinks he's crazy, Aquarius midheaven. He was also very, very quickly regarded as this cult figure. It makes sense. He's got this Aquarius midheaven that literally is being a cult figure in the public eye. But it's square his sun and his Uranus and his Saturn. What he really wanted was never to be this cult figure. He wanted to be a part of this group, a part of this freedom club. So on June 8th, 1996, Ted Kaczynski, or the Unabomber's trial started. He was on trial for murdering 3 people. His trial lasted a few years. It lasted from 1996 to 1998. I would also like to point out that during these years, Neptune and Uranus were in Capricorn, and then at the very end, towards 1998, they were in the very earliest degrees of Aquarius. If you look at his chart and see where these degrees of Capricorn and Aquarius are held, it's his 8th house, which is the house of trials. It is the house of jail. It is the house of questioning your sanity. It is the darkest house. It is the Scorpio house, so it makes complete sense that he was on trial during these years. It's so literal. Also, what was a huge thing is that Ted did not want to be seen as a lunatic. He did not want to be seen as a crazy person, and he was absolutely 100% adamant about this. And it was so frustrating because that's what his attorneys kept on telling them that he needed to do. He needed to say he was crazy because there's that clause that if you're seen as clinically insane or whatever it might be, that you can get out of your jail time and just go to like a mental health facility. And I think that makes so much sense that Uranus and Neptune were transiting his 8th house, because those two energies are kind of like the crazy person energies, the mentally ill energies. You know, Uranus is the crazy person, that just does all these weird things that nobody understands, and then Neptune is like mental illness, and that's when it was in this 8th house. So his lawyers and everyone was telling him, you have to be seen as insane, you have to be seen as crazy, and he was like, but I'm not crazy, I'm not insane, I am very sane, I understand completely what I'm thinking and what I did. And it would also completely undermine him because his whole point of doing these crimes was his manifesto, was to get his ideas out there. And if he is seen as insane, then nobody's going to take his ideas seriously. And that was so critical. That was the whole point. He literally was a martyr for his ideas. Neptune in the 4th house in Virgo. He was kind of also a martyr for revolution with that Aquarius midheaven. I don't think he's crazy. I don't think he's a paranoid schizophrenic at all. I just think he's autistic. So the attorneys absolutely and completely lied to Ted. His Pluto's in his 3rd house, his Chiron's in his 3rd house, and they said they were not going to go with the insanity plea, but when they got to the trial, they wound up going with the insanity plea. So basically that night, he realizes that his choices were to either allow his attorneys to represent him as a madman or accept a plea bargain. After that happened, he tried to kill himself. I think this makes sense. The amount of commitment he has to his mind, to his ideas, to his manifesto, it's his Gemini stellium. It's his whole life's work. It's his everything. Obviously, he was not able to kill himself. So on January 22nd, 1998, his trial came to a very abrupt end because he decided to plead guilty for those 3 murders in exchange for life in prison. He wound up not getting the death penalty because he did not go through with the trial, and that was the whole thing of the plea bargain. So he spent a very long time, I think 27 years, in supermax prison. It also again reflects his Sun and Saturn and Uranus in the 12th house and this complete isolation. His initial kind of being sent to the hospital with these rashes, being alone for a few weeks, reflects his time in his cabin in the woods, which reflects his time in this supermax prison. The main difference between this is just when it's his choice, he wants to be outdoors, and when it's not his choice, he's forced to be indoors. He's even quoted saying that his biggest fear is that he might become comfortable in supermax and not even resented anymore, which in turn will make him a part of the system. Also, I think it's interesting because that Neptune in the 4th house follows him again, because there is a level of codependency when you're in prison. You get your meals, you don't have to pay for things, people will clean up after you. Again, this kind of level of codependency continues. During his time in prison, he communicates with people on the outside. There's a bunch of people writing him letters back and forth. He reads a lot. He even gets a few books published. He has a whole author page on Amazon, actually, which is crazy. And he basically winds up being able to be a voice for what he wants to get done. Ted Kaczynski was 80 years old when he was moved to Supermax's medical facility. This was in December of 2021. He is rumored to have been diagnosed with terminal cancer, but we only know this because a letter that he wrote to one of his correspondents. So Ted Kaczynski died on June 10th, 2023. And what's interesting is that it's rumored that he killed himself. It's rumored that it's suicide, and it's not said that he died of terminal cancer. Now, at this point that I'm recording this video, that's all the information I could find out about it, which I think is really interesting. I would also like to note that in 1990, his father also killed himself. So if Ted Kaczynski did kill himself, I think that is also modeled after his son in his 12th house. His dad killed himself. The 12th house is that thing of like life between life and death and the womb and this weird kind of in-between phase. And his father killed himself. And so it would almost kind of be like modeling himself after his father in a weird way if he did kill himself. And if you look at his chart, his final placement in his wheel is his Saturn in his 12th house. That's the final placement before his rising. He died completely secluded, completely alone for a very, very long time, having to kind of pay for all of his bad deeds, having to live his life in this complete kind of depressive solitude, alone and with nothing and with no one, which is very Saturn in the 12th house. I think his tale is a sad one. But yes, this concludes my first episode of the True Crime Astrology podcast. If you stuck it out to the end, that's amazing. Thank you so much. I know this video is going to be ridiculously long. Thank you for being here. If you have any thoughts about Ted Kaczynski's birth chart, connecting it to his life, I'd love to hear it. I'm very curious. And thank you so much for watching. Bye.